Hello everyone and welcome to my new video. This week I'm going to be painting this demonic lady with really long finger claws coming out of some mist, and she's going to be wearing some shiny leather. So what you'll see today are some time lapses of how I do that, and also I'm going to talk about the paints that I'm using. Here's the skin time lapse, and it just sort of shows you in really sped up time. I think this is like 2 hours, maybe less, an hour and a half, of me layering up and building up values on the body. I'm using QoR paints, QoR Golden, today, and they are really nice, but there are some flaws as well. So I thought I'd sort of chat to you about that and chat to you a bit about what I'm doing to make this painting, etc. But if you'd like to catch my real-time video of the process of painting her bodice and the clouds around her, head to patreon.com/finelinerNerd and pledge to the Stars in My Night Sky tier, and you'll have access to all of my past full-length real-time tutorials. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the paints. QoR are famous, I'm sure many of you know what they're about, but they're famous for their special binder that they use that makes the paints flow a lot more, so they really spread across the page. And I wanted to use them for this because I needed the paint to just blur really beautifully where I was placing it in the clouds, which you'll see a little bit later. So there was a strategic reason why I used them, but they're also really bright. I know there are quite a lot of watercolour brands out there at the moment that are quite bright. You've got Daniel Smith, you've got Sennelier, who else have I used? Kuretake are really bright watercolours, though they're not traditional watercolours or traditional Western watercolours. But they're also bright. So there are a lot of companies out there doing really bright things, but QoR is a brand that's doing it really well. The only downside to QoR is that I find that you need a lot more paint than, say, Daniel Smith to get the same kind of colour level. And I haven't really tested it. It's really difficult to do with tubes because it's like, well, how much paint do I put in the water? How do I measure that without being kind of without getting a really tiny syringe, which I don't have. I'm sure I could measure it. But yeah, I just feel like when I'm mixing it, I'm not getting instantaneous results. I felt like I had to play around with the mixture a bit to get the colour levels right. So that was interesting. But aside from that, the paints offer really good coverage. They layer really well. They don't lift off very easily. So if you put it down and you try and lift some paint up later, or even while it's still wet, it will have soaked into the paper quite quickly. So they're not great if you make a mistake, but they're fantastic for glazing. So if you're laying down one colour and you want to apply a different colour over the top or layer on top with the same colour, they're amazing because it kind of just stays there. I find with some paints that I use, especially when I'm building up skin tones, I find that the more I paint in the paler areas, the more of that paint comes away with every brush stroke. But you can see here, I've got really good even coverage on her skin. There are no sort of really pale or washed out patches where the paint is thinnest. And that tends to happen with other paints that I've used. So all in all, very impressed. Now I'm not doing like a swatching thing here to show you the colours in the set. I got the 12 colour set. It's got a couple of reds, a couple of yellows, a couple of blues, and then a few fringe colours. Of course, with a Payne's grey. And I really like their Payne's grey because it's a really good middle ground between like grey and blue. It's not too blue, so it looks like a midnight sky, but it doesn't look too black or purple or green. It's a really nice colour. But yeah, I'm not doing the swatching thing because I just thought, sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked there. I'm not doing the swatching bit because I just wanted you to see what the paints are like in real life, like as I'm using them to paint, because I find that that is one way of looking at paint. If anybody would like to see me swatch with them and show examples of how the paint flows and everything else and do a really deep dive into the sort of technical aspects of the QoR paints, then let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to do that for you guys. And then I thought I'd talk a little bit about what I'm doing here. So the clouds are probably the most interesting part of this. I've talked about building skin tone and everything else in the past. But I love this technique because I don't often use wet in wet. It's too unpredictable and I get really stressed out. I have to work really quickly. But I've been playing with wet and wet techniques lately and I'm a lot less stressed. It's like when you play Fortnite for the first time and you're trying to learn how to build in the middle of a firefight. That's what trying to learn wet and wet is like when you're actually painting a painting that you really love and you think is going well. You're like, oh no, I'm going to ruin it. And as with Fortnite, a little bit of practice makes things a lot easier. So for any of you that are nervous about using wet and wet techniques, because they're unpredictable, take it from me, person who sort of struggled through it, take it from me that it's actually a really simple process once you get used to it. So put in lots and lots of practice, lots of scrap paper, just play around with it, play around with water levels on your brush, play around with how much paint you have on your brush versus water, etc, etc. But the key here and what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that my paper is always soaked and I'm working methodically around the paper so that as I'm moving forward, the paper is wet and the paper that I've painted behind as I travel around the page is left to start drying out. But as the paper gets less and less damp, I have then returned to it just while there's still a little bit of moisture in there, just to add a little bit more colour. And it's sort of hard to describe, but as you can see here, I'm laying down quite big areas of pale grey, so that's with a really big brush, I'm discharging loads of paint into the wet paper, and then I'm letting that dry somewhat so that it's damp, and then going back in with a smaller brush with a more saturated mixture of paint to add depth to the clouds. And because the paper is less wet than before, it means that the paint just blurs just enough around the edges that it looks really nice and soft, and it doesn't cause like a ring, like a hard edge around the paint that you've put down. So really, using wet and wet like I have with these clouds is all about soaking the paper with your brush with clean water, laying down some colour where you want it to kind of outline, you're sort of sketching in the depth in the clouds, and then you're really leaning into that depth later on once some of that moisture is gone. It allows you to build up really, really quickly and really, really easily this really realistic picture of an environment that's actually quite simple. I'm not painting buildings, I'm not painting trees, there's nothing around here. It's really quite understated, but I think quite effective. Alright, don't forget that if you want to see this full tutorial for painting those clouds and the shine on her garment, head to patreon.com/finelinerNerd. Thank you very much for watching. It just means the world that anybody watches my videos. And a massive thank you to my patrons who make all this possible.